I attended seminary at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church. It is the oldest Episcopal seminary, and it is the only seminary that is sanctioned by General Convention. As you can imagine, a 200-year-old seminary is steeped in tradition, and there is no place that this was more true than in the chapel. And by tradition, I mean rules. There were a lot of rules. There were rules about where to stand, there were rules about where to sit, there were rules about which way you turned when you were holding a candle, there were rules about which way your hands went when you held the candle, there were rules about everything. But the worst part about the rules at seminary, and particularly in the chapel, was the way that the rules were enforced by the chapel leadership. Chapel was sort of led and maintained by a couple of professors, but mostly by upper-class students. And rarely in my life have I encountered a more arrogant, pretentious, nasty group of people in my entire life. When they were training us freshmen as acolytes, they were rude, they were condescending, they would berate us and humiliate us when we made mistakes in practice. They were worse when we made a mistake in an actual worship service. I observed more than a few people leaving after serving in the chapel crying because of how poorly they had been treated. And as I watched this happen, I thought to myself, if this is how we are training priests in the church, this place is doomed. Now, one of the most important rules in chapel, one of the first ones we were advised of, was that one must wear black or brown closed-toed shoes when serving on the altar. If someone were to observe your toes in a pair of sandals, it might ruin their worship experience. If someone were to see a flash of color at the bottom of your alb, it might distract them from praying properly. So it was black and brown closed shoes that you were to wear on the altar, and this was stressed early on because in case you didn't own a pair, you were to buy a pair. Can you see where this is going? Yeah, so it came time for me to serve in the chapel, and I had had it up to my eyeballs with the way these people were behaving. And so I arrived to serve as an acolyte for a weekday Eucharist service in a pair of red cowboy boots. The look of horror that came across the faces of everyone in the sacristy when I arrived from the leadership and my classmates was absolutely priceless. And I fully expected to be sent home, but I wasn't. And in fact, nobody said anything to me at all. And so I served an entire noon Eucharist in a pair of bright red cowboy boots. Now, later that day, I got an email from the chief sacristan noting that I had not followed the shoe rule and thanking me in advance for complying the next time I served. I replied that I thought it was awfully presumptuous of him to thank me in advance for my compliance. And it was very interesting for me to then watch what happened at seminary as a result of this defiance, right? Most of the upper class just stopped talking to me entirely. Everyone was talking to each other about me. A few folks in my class, in the class ahead of me, sort of very surreptitiously gave me the thumbs up, but they didn't want anybody to know that they were associated with me for fear that they would also be ostracized, right? And in a delightful casual conversation I had with one of the upperclassmen one afternoon, he said to me, "It seems like you're not a very good fit here at General. Are you thinking about transferring to another seminary?" I was clearly not very welcome at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church. In our gospel today, Jesus finds himself in a little bit of a tangle with the Pharisees. The gospel story begins with Jesus and his disciples out for a walk on the Sabbath, snacking their way through a wheat field. And the Pharisees point out that this is very clearly a violation of the Sabbath law. They should not be out wandering around, and they should not be gathering food. They should be resting and eating food that had been gathered the day before. And Jesus reminds them that the law is not made to make our life harder. The law is made to extend God's grace and God's love to us. And humankind is not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made for humankind. And he even reminds them of a story where David and his warriors broke one of the most important laws, which was not to eat the sacrificed food for the priests in the temple. But they were starving. And it doesn't make sense to have a rule that would leave someone starving and hungry. That's not how God's love and grace are extended in the world. But here's the thing. Jesus' response to the Pharisees was not revolutionary. Jesus was not saying anything to the Pharisees that the Pharisees didn't already know. The Sabbath being made for mankind, mankind not for the Sabbath, that is pretty common knowledge. The Pharisees wouldn't have disagreed with Jesus upon that point. They didn't really like, however, that Jesus was pointing out the way they were using the law to abuse and exclude people. And it happens in the next part of the story. Jesus goes into the temple, and he looks at the man with the withered hand and calls him over to heal him. And the looks of horror that come across the faces of everyone in that room must have been priceless for Jesus. And Jesus calls them out on it. Is it better to give life or kill life on the Sabbath? This is not revolutionary for the Pharisees. The Pharisees know this. The Pharisees know that the law is designed to extend God's love and God's grace, and that to give life on the Sabbath is the right thing to do. But the Pharisees are not very happy about Jesus pointing out the ways that they are twisting and distorting the law. When I was in seminary, I didn't really care very much what shoes I wore on the altar. I didn't really care very much about what rules you used and where you stood and where you sat. What I cared about was the way people were being treated. What I noticed at seminary was that people had gotten so invested in the rules that they had stopped being invested in the people. They had gotten so steeped in their tradition that they forgot that the purpose of the place was the community of God that was gathered to form priests. And the people at seminary, and particularly the chapel leadership, were not angry with me because I had worn red shoes. They were angry with me because I had pointed out how badly they were behaving, because I had made note of the fact that they had stopped treating us with the grace and love that God intends for us to treat one another. Jesus did not inherently have a problem with the law. Jesus even says in the Gospel of Matthew, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus knows the law, and Jesus is spot on in his argument about the law. The Pharisees couldn't even really disagree with him. And the Pharisees aren't angry with Jesus about his interpretation of the law. They're angry with Jesus because he has pointed out that they are using the law to abuse and exclude and marginalize people. That they have become so in service to the law that they have forgotten to be in service to God. That they have forgotten to be in service to the people that the law is supposed to protect. And this is the trouble with rules. Now let me state for the record, I am a rule follower. I am the first child in my family raised by a quintessential rule follower. If there is a rule, I follow it. I put my seatbelt on every time I get in the car, even if I am just moving the car around in my own driveway. I come to a complete stop at every stop sign. I pay my taxes on time every year. I get my teeth cleaned every 6 months. I am a rule follower. I like rules. I like order. And rules bring order from chaos. But the challenge with the human condition is that we can get so connected to our rules that we begin to work in service of the rules instead of in service of the people that the rules are supposed to protect. And we go even further to create rules that exclude and marginalize and abuse people. So what's the good news of the gospel today? Jesus reminds us that we always have agency. Jesus shows us by example that we have a voice and that we are to use that voice in our churches, in our schools, in our neighborhoods, in our government, in our families. We are to watch and observe the ways that rules are being used to marginalize and abuse and exclude people. And that we have opportunities to affect change there. We all get to vote on Tuesday. I challenge you as you vote this time to think through the lens of the ways that we use our laws and our rules to either love people or exclude people. We have opportunities at work. We have opportunities everywhere we go to speak out against oppression and injustice, even in tiny, tiny little ways. You know the biggest ways that churches exclude people? They don't tell them how to make the coffee. If you don't know how to make the coffee, you don't have any power in a church. Tiny, 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 tiny little ways. And big, big, big giant ways. Then we exclude and marginalize people because we have rules. And our rules about how we make the coffee are so important to us that we can't teach you how to do it because you might do it wrong. Jesus reminds us that we have agency and we have a voice, and that we are to use that voice. But here's where the rubber meets the road, and here's where it gets really hard and really tricky and really nasty. Because Jesus also is reminding us that we have ears to listen. And I think that for us, we are much more likely in this scenario to be the Pharisees than we are to be Jesus. We are the wealthy people. We are the people of privilege. We are the people with power. We are the people who are making the rules. We are the ones in this story who are most likely to be so invested in our rules that we have stopped paying attention to how they are being used to abuse and exclude and marginalize people. And the next time you hear a voice that makes you bristle just a little bit, makes you a tiny bit defensive and offends you, I would encourage you to listen carefully to that voice and ask yourself whether that's the voice of Jesus pointing out the place of power and privilege that you have, asking you to consider whether you are now in a place of power where you are so invested in the rules that you have forgotten how to expand God's love and God's grace to every human being. Jesus sets an example for us in this story, both about how to use our voice and how to use our ears. Jesus invites us to follow him. Amen.